If I were trying to create a good ethical climate in my company, 3 steps that I would consider would be, first, on the selection side, working on screening out the most selfish people. They're people that I call the takers. Whereas givers tend to be very generous, helpful, and concerned about others in the organization, takers tend to be much more all about me. If you screen them out, then you eliminate some of the worst behavior, and then it's easier for everyone else to engage in good business practice. Secondly, I'd focus on measuring performance differently, not just looking at individual contributions, but rather tracking what's the impact of my success on the people around me. And that way, it's hard to get ahead by doing things that may benefit me but harm other people. Third, I would try to create an environment where people are mobilized and encouraged to seek help. In a lot of organizations, people cut corners because they think that there's not enough knowledge or resources or connections available. And if it becomes less of a burden, less of a source of vulnerability and incompetence to ask other people for help, it may be that they find ways of solving problems that don't require ethical shortcuts. How do you screen out the takers, the people who are willing to harm others for personal gain? And it turns out there are lots of ways to do that. One way is to pay less attention to what they achieve and more attention to how they explain their achievements. So we find that there are 2 words takers tend to use more than the rest of us when talking about success. They're I and me. And if you look for those words, you can often catch them in the act. A lot of employees do work that makes a difference, but they have no idea how or for whom. So you may work on a product or a service that really benefits a group of people, but you have no contact with those people. One of the things I've studied then is what happens when you make that face-to-face connection. When an automotive engineer gets to meet a driver or a passenger in a car, does that engineer become more concerned about safety? If you're a medical research scientist and you have no patient contact, you get to see the real consequences of your work for keeping people healthy and alive. Does that make you more concerned about doing the best work that you can? And the answer in those cases is yes, that when people get to see the individuals who are affected by their work, they become much more concerned about working fairly, safely, ethically, and in a way that ultimately helps the people around them. When you're trying to diagnose ethical culture, one of the biggest challenges you face is that you can't always trust people to report on what they themselves would do. So you give people a scenario or you ask them to make judgments, and of course they will tend to respond in the most desirable way. If you really want to figure out if you have an ethical culture, ask people to predict not what they would do, but rather what other people would do. There's a lot of research on projection bias, and it's the basic idea that when we make predictions about other people's actions, we tend to basically see more of ourselves in others than we perhaps should. And so if you're in an organization that's highly unethical, the expectations you have about unethical behavior are pretty high. Similarly, if you yourself are consistently engaging in patterns of unethical behavior, it's pretty common that you would find yourself guessing that other people would be unethical because that's your own tendency. And so if you have people make judgments about the group, about the collective, or about what most other people would do, you can pretty quickly figure out, is this an ethical culture or not? Every leader I work with is trying to figure out how to fight gender biases. And one of the biggest barriers to that is defensiveness. People are constantly saying, oh yeah, I know biases are out there. You're biased, I'm not. I've learned a lot about this from Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook. And she says, look, I wrote a whole book on gender bias. I still have these biases. Even today, I'm standing in a room and I have a whole group of men and women, and I call on the men first. I don't mean to do it, but it happens. People start to say, oh wow, well, if you're biased, it's possible that I am too. I think that every time we talk about bias, it's useful to say, look, here are my biases, and I'm gonna put those on the table, and then other people are more likely to open up as well. After I got tenure as a professor, I decided I was gonna try to share my insights with a broader audience. So I sat down to write the book, and I ended up writing about 103,000 words, and I sent them to my agent, and he said, I don't even think your mom would read this. It's just not something that would ever be interesting to the rest of the world. And I realized that I'm really prone to falling into tunnel vision. And this is something that a lot of leaders face. You find out maybe it's not going exactly as expected, you double down, you try to work even harder to make sure that it succeeds. I was so invested in finishing the book that I ended up wasting a few more months. It's critical to get feedback along the way, especially when you're trying to champion a new idea and take on a task you haven't done before. Leaders love to hire on cultural fit. Working as a manager leading an advertising team, I was looking for people who fit every single core value that we held. And a couple months went by and our company's performance completely tanked. Why? I'd hired a bunch of people who think exactly in the same way that I did. They didn't bring diversity of thought to the table. So I ended up taking a bet on somebody who really did not fit the sales culture at all. And it turned out that he had really creative solutions to problems. He was the most productive salesperson in the history of our team. Cultural fit actually holds us back. Why not figure out what's missing from the culture and then bring in people who can actually add that to the table?